What's up, everybody? This is a Commons Beaumont book, a lot like McDarry that I was reading the last couple videos, and where McDarry pegs the birthplace of civilization in Ireland, Commons says it came from Britain. This is supposed to be the long lost final book by Beaumont, published in 2015, and his other books were published around the 1940s. And it really seems like people at that time had a desire to prove that their people were the descendants of the noble cultures of the past, especially Atlantis. The jacket summary says this is the fourth in a series of 4 books on revised history and geography of Britain and the world, exposing the centuries-long conspiracy initiated by Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea 325 AD. The plan to move the historical and religious sites of Britain to their now familiar locations in the Middle East was intended as a short-term fix to strengthen the Roman Empire, but the whole world still suffers from the consequences today. So he also says the original Jerusalem is Edinburgh, Scotland, and that Jesus was born and raised in Somerset. Also, that there was a great catastrophe that wiped out the ancient world, including Atlantis, which I believe he says was connected to what's Britain is left over from Atlantis, basically, and that there was a mistranslation in Plato's Timaeus. Instead of 9,000 years, it was supposed to be 9,000 months. And I believe he puts the fall of Atlantis around 1300 BC. I'm not saying if any of it's true or false, but he touches on a lot of interesting things along the way that I do agree with. So here's what he's got to say about things. Oh yeah, he uses this name quite a bit, and I'll just call them the REs because that's a bad word around here. And they've been pretty sensitive with anything to do with this. They always wiki sticky things that totally aren't happening, you know. But it wasn't just the Germansies that had an interest in the REs. I've never really cared who did what first, but it was a big subject, 100 years ago. Chapter 1, Britain, Mother of Civilization. This work, in various ways, enlarges upon the claims advanced in my previous volumes that the Ari race evolved in the British Isles, originally from the Shetland, Orkney Isles, and Mull, once of considerable size, but shattered and torn apart by the greatest catastrophe in world history. Summarized in the book of Genesis as the flood of Noah, although the Bible contains considerable information on the subject only intended to be understood by the initiated. For, properly construed, the history of the Old Testament is the history of prehistoric Britain onward. The great catastrophe in question, as my former readers are well aware, records a period when the then highly civilized world, in the throes of a great war, was smitten by a cometary body, or to be more correct, by 2 cometary bodies, one of which collapsed over a large part of the British Isles with most violent and tragic results. It was an age of considerable populations and many large walled cities. I have traced this civilization over a large area and have been able to identify it with the use of Bible and classical records, legends and myths, archaeology, astronomy, geology, and not least by place names, which frequently survive in the least suspected places. I wish to emphasize the claim of the Aries to have been the first founders of world civilization and to indicate the importance of climate to the development of civilizations. In the book Evolution of Climate, the author appears to be in agreement and contends the districts where civilization began probably had at that time the most stimulating climate in the Northern Hemisphere. Anthropology supports this view and also teaches that the Ari never originated in the East. So what is to be said of the religious claims that the Adamites, who it is not disputed, evolved in a land named Mesopotamia between the rivers, must never have belonged to that region which geographers term the Afrasian steppe desert belt, which stretches from China to the Atlas Mountains in northwest Africa. Now let us turn to the north. It is my task to prove conclusively that Britain was the original Atlantis of Plato and that in the northernmost parts of the British Isles, from the Shetland Orkney group, once incomparably greater in size, but now largely drowned, and from the adjoining regions arose the Ari race, the founders of civilization. Scotland, on the authority of many archaeologists, was the birthplace of the Ari race, who may be traced throughout the ages from the Paleolithic to the Iron Age. These were the sons of Adam, the Titans or giants of Greek tradition. Sanchoniathon, the Phoenician sage, says that Phoenicia, meaning the old red lands of Scotland, was first inhabited by men of vast bulk and height, called aletes, or elites, nobles. A modern authority on this subject, L.A. Waddell, who spent his professional career in India and devoted over a quarter of a century to the question of the Aries, says, I eventually found that despite all that has been written about the vast antiquity of civilization in India, there was absolutely no trace of any higher civilization in India before the 7th century BC. Historical India, like historical Greece, suddenly bursts into view about 600 BC in the pages of Buddhist literature and in the Mahabharata epic, with a fully fledged Ari civilization of precisely the same general type, which has persisted down to the present day. Nowadays, they say the Mahabharata took place between 2000 to 3000 BC, depending on who you ask. But back in 1940, Waddell, who spent 25 years in India, says that this was around 600 BC, and they all sprung on the scenes like the ancient Greeks did. Before Greek civilization, which is about 600 BC by their dating, was the Greek Dark Ages. Greek civilization just popped on the scene and started making buildings like the Parthenon, and he's saying the same thing happened in India. Furthermore, he states, new keys unloosed the sealed stories of history and disclosed them, the Phoenicians, to be the leading branch of the Ari race. Also, in script and speech, these were the lineal parents of the Britons, Scots, and Anglo-Saxons. So, this is another author saying that they've told us about the Phoenicians backwards, and that the Phoenician were Aries that colonized part of the Mediterranean and not the other way around. The Ari civilization Waddell refers to was, I believe, the Brahmin religion. The caste system was introduced by the Ari conquerors to preserve, if possible, the purity of blood of its settlers, as was the case in Mexico. A generation or two ago, a number of philologists with high-sounding professional titles sought to derive the Sanskrit, the earliest tongue of the Aries, from some ancestral source in the vague, undefined region of Central Asia, and to claim that it was carried thence into Northern Europe. However, anthropologists destroyed that quaint myth, for it was proved that at no time was there any migration from Asia into Europe. If we take the subject of the origin of language, admittedly, the Chaldean, Hebrew, Phoenician, and Greek were all derived from one paternal source. It is surprising to note how closely related to the ancient Hebrew is the Welsh tongue. Leland, a very learned man of the Royal Antiquary, declared that the Cymric language is closely related to the ancient Hebrew and Greek, although these tongues are supposed to have originated from the other end of the ancient world. The truth is that the Gaels, Hiberno-Celts, Iberians, and Hebrews were all originally derived from the same source, who dwelt originally on the Scottish mainland or in the many isles then blessed with a subtropical climate, their primordial homeland. They spoke the same language, or sounds, which doubtless varied according to local conditions, in differing dialects, its original source inspired by the direction of the once prosperous and important ruling island, Shetland Orkney, the Crete of the Greeks. This Ari speech may seem to have been carried not so much eastward in the primitive days as westward to Central America, then easily reached, and where latter arose the Mayan Empire, named probably after Maya, goddess daughter of Zeus and Pleione, one of the Atlantides isles drowned in the Great Catastrophe. The importance of Maya was that she was the fabled mother of the great deity Hermes, who represented the priestly class. So, yeah, I've heard before how the Maya language was supposed to be like the purest form of some previous root language, Atlantis language or something. And then the Aztec have the mythology of the five suns where the world's been destroyed four times before. And they say the last time was a flood, the one before that was fire, and it agrees with what the Greeks say about things, which we'll get into here in a minute. A shout out to Barbara Roulette, Jason Miller, Will Cronin, Mikhail Bobrovsky, I think, Octoritas Publishing, Selim Abraham, and Emery's McRin. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. Let us now pass to the more essential problems of the past. For those unfamiliar with the word Atlantis, it is essential to make the legend plain, because although Atlantis was Britain, it must be clearly recognized. Plato, in his Timaeus, described how the famous Athenian philosopher and statesman Solon visited Sais in what we now know as Egypt and talked of ancient subjects within his knowledge. One of the priests, who was of great age, said, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are but children, and there is never an old man who is a Hellene." The priest thereupon described how fire from heaven destroyed the island of Atlantis, a terrible catastrophe explained in the form of a myth where Phaeton, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds of his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burned up all that was upon the earth and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Said the priest to Solon, this really signified a declination of the celestial bodies moving around the earth and in the heavens, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth recurring at long intervals of time. So, yeah, I've told the Phaeton story several times, and they're pretty clear that a celestial body came down and burnt up parts of the earth. And it sounds like it was an airburst or there was a cosmic thunderbolt or something going on, but it sounds like they say Zeus threw his thunderbolt to stop Phaeton's destruction on earth. I know that ain't some people's jam, but that's what they say happened. It will be observed that the myth described in this declination of heavenly bodies as a chariot. The explanation is that the chariot was a two-wheeled carriage, and on certain ancient coins of Greece and of Scotland also, the event is portrayed with the steeds in the form of Pegasus and the chariot by wheels, with the twin comets aflame. On certain engraved Scottish stones, and expressly the Gopsy stone, of which more hereafter, the wheel and axle are illustrated by two separate but linked circles. Thus did the ancient Britons endeavor to preserve for posterity an account of the terrible affliction they underwent, whose sinister traces yet survive, although unappreciated by geologists who have completely gone astray over this extraordinary world event. It is true that Britain, in Plato's account, is disguised under the name of Atlantis, but the aged priest proceeded further. "You do not know that there dwelt in your land," he said, yet speaking of this Atlantis, "the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, of whom you and your city are but a seed or remnant." He added, "There was a time, Solon, before the great deluge of all, when the city which is now Athens was first in war and was preeminent from the excellence of her laws, and is said to have performed the noblest deeds and to have the fairest constitution of any of which tradition tells." The foregoing tells us that the original city of Athens had flourished in the island of Atlantis, not in the country we call Greece today. Nor did he stop there. According to the Timaeus, the Egyptians were themselves originally a colony from Atlantis. The citizens of this city, Sais, are great lovers of the Athenians, he continued, and say that they are in some way related to them. In describing the invasion of Atlantis by a vast power from across the sea, which preceded the great catastrophe, he said, "The vast power thus gathered into one endeavored to subdue in one blow our country and yours, and the whole of the land which was within the straits." He concluded by stating that afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of rain, all your warlike men sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared and was sunk beneath the sea. So I had heard of the glory of Athens all of my life, but it wasn't till, internet days that I actually saw a picture of the original Athens. And it looks to me like this is maybe 2,000 people. I mean, it's really not very big, but this was the world's superpower back in the day. So I'm told, or it was just the vacation home of a god. I don't know. It is important in relation to this account of the priest of Siaz to note that the subsequent religious faith of Egypt in the Mediterranean, of Osiris, Horus, and the underworld, so vividly portrayed in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, was based entirely upon the destruction of Atlantis. It relates to the very heart of the disaster in Britain, and notably is placed along the west coast of Scotland and the Isles in the Hebridean Sea. The same belief, slightly varied, was held by the ancient Scots, whose underworld lay on the mainland opposite the Isle of Skye. These are factors over which every thoughtful reader should ponder. Our modern world should be grateful to the ancient priest of Siaz and to Plato for giving us this information, which otherwise would doubtless have never been realized. The aged priest, however, made two errors in his story which have led many subsequent investigators astray. The island of Atlantis may have been largely submerged for a period, and doubtless was, in conjunction with the enormous tidal waves that resulted, but it was not permanently drowned, although certain regions in the west were. A great stretch of mountainous heights could not be submerged for good, and this would especially apply to Atlantis with Mount Atlas and many other high mountains. His second error lies in the evident misuse of the term 900 or 9,000 years as the period of submersion of Atlantis from the period of Solon, due to a looseness in the describing periods we find in both classic and Bible works. It is opposed to the astronomical evidence to believe that the submergence of the island was earlier than 1300 BC, and if we take years to have signified months and date back 9,000 months or 750 years, we approximate to the truth. Moreover, in Critias of Plato, which describes Atlantis in detail, it explains that the Atlanteans were familiar with the uses of bronze and iron, and in short, as confirmed in other directions, the great catastrophe occurred in the early Iron Age, a period of great advancement in the use of weapons of war and other lost scientific discoveries. Researchers have indicated that prior to the event in question, the then living pharaoh was Sesostris, who had retreated from the foreign invaders of his country and was in the region of the Isle of Mull at the time of the collapse of land and sea. In this very same direction on the mainland, Deucalion, the Thessalian version of Noah, had been previously warned by the, quote, Father Prometheus, a famous volcano which some short time before produced an abortive eruption, and so prepared him for the sequel, hastened to build his ark and to be ready for all emergencies. A folklore memory which existed throughout the subsequent Greek and Hebrew ages. So, like I mentioned earlier about the Maya and their myth of the five sons, the last destruction of the world was a flood, and the one before that was fire. Well, in the Greek version of things, it's the same. Last one was a flood, and Deucalion is, a lot of people say it's the same as Noah, but he and his wife were the ones that survived the flood, and then prior to that was Phaeton, which we talked about a minute ago, who came down and burnt up the world. I will cite here a remarkable passage of Diodorus Siculus, which indicates clearly the true region of the flood. Osiris marched away into Ethiopia, Whilst they were thus employed, the Nile, they say, at the time of Sirius's rising, inundated the greatest part of Egypt, and especially that part where Prometheus ruled, inasmuch as almost all the inhabitants were destroyed, and Prometheus was near offing himself for very grief of heart. From the sudden and violent eruption of the waters, it was called Aetos, eagle. Later, it was given the name of Egyptus, after a king that reigned there. The last name it derived, Nile, is from Nilios, a king of those parts. What region was Diodorus describing with his wealth of detail? It could not have been the Egypt we know, because Prometheus was the volcano on an island adjoining Thessaly in Greece. Also, if the Nile were a name for the ocean, it could not relate either to the southern Egypt or to the Thessaly in present Greece. He expressly describes the tragedy as situated on the borders of the ocean, which he says was later called the Nile, a word by the by known to Professor Masters, one of the great authorities of ancient Egypt, but in fact it is obtained from the Sanskrit, where the word Nila signified blue or blue-black and descriptive of the ocean depths, but never the yellow muddy Nile in Africa. The term river, however, is used by Homer to illustrate the current of the ocean and the river stream of Oceanus, and it is taking no liberty to claim that it related to the ancient Gulf Stream, which washes the shores of Britain. Diodorus speaks of the river of ocean, and he says that Osiris, meaning the pharaoh who became later deified as Osiris, god of the underworld, was proceeding into Ethiopia, the Red Lands, when the catastrophe took place. Diodorus, in short, definitely points to a Thessaly and Prometheus by the Atlantic Ocean and calls it Egypt. So opposed is it to all conventional acceptance of classical sites that Diodorus has been set aside accordingly. It agrees, however, in every respect with the fact relating to the destruction of Atlantis. The original Thessaly, indeed the only true Thessaly, where today is Argyllshire, and the volcanic mountain Prometheus, may be identified with confidence to be Ben More, Great Mountain, formerly all aflame, which dominates the Isle of Mull. So we're looking at Ben More in the background there in Scotland, and it is, in fact, an extinct volcano. Of course, they say it was 60 million years ago. Now, my story on that is, in Southern California, they built the toll roads not very long ago. I mean, it was maybe 10 years old max when I was living there. And there are road cuts and mounds on the side that are obviously part of the road construction process. It looks just like everything else. Even in the desert where things don't grow that fast, the vegetation is the same as everything else. You could look at it and think it's been there for 1,000 years. So I think the geologists are absolutely crazy when they throw out their 60 million years numbers. Now, it may be, I mean, all evidence suggests that Earth has been here for a very, very long time, kind of a never-ending cycle here. But, I've got the same thing around here, national forests where they just cut the roads back in like the 1930s or something. And there's a abandoned iron ore mine. And, it just looks like it's always been that way. So I don't think anybody can honestly tell the difference between a volcano going extinct 3,000 years ago or 60 million years ago, especially when catastrophes occur that can change the landscape in no time at all. So, I still don't know what to make all of this. I wish there was more evidence being put forth here, but I just find it interesting. So if you're still listening, you must have found it interesting. If you want, you can find this book on Internet Archives for free. It's The Great Deception by Commons Beaumont, Comyn. And we're on page 29. I got to wrap this up. I got to get to the lumberyard before they close, and everything's closed on Monday. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.